Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Whether toxic chemicals are affecting our health, our fertility, or the health of our children, it is common to feel a range of emotions. Anger is actually one of the most common emotions you may feel in your detox journey. We can become angry with the government for not stepping in, our loved ones for making it harder to make lifestyle changes, or ourselves for not making changes as fast as we think we should. Anger manifests in many ways, including how you react to others and then how you treat yourself. Living with anger can cause long-term stress and rob you of happy moments. This is why we're so glad to be chatting with Dr. Vanessa Ruiz. Dr. Ruiz is a PTSD expert who specializes in trauma healing and dealing with anger. So during this live, we're going to discuss how to deal with anger and creating emotional resiliency. Here she is.
Hi.
Dr. Ruiz, how are you?
So, how are you?
Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. This topic is such a fun topic.
And we don't see that many NDs doing this, so we're gonna dive in. This is amazing. Um, Tell us a little bit about your background and how you became a pathic doctor.
It's actually a very convoluted story, but I'll spare you all the details. I actually was originally a nurse, and in nursing, I saw the same patients coming in and out. It was like a revolving door, and they only got stable. They never really got better. And actually, during that whole process, we know how our healthcare providers, they are super stressed. And it was when I was a nurse that I actually got sick. And in getting sick, I went the conventional route because that's what I knew. Right? And after about a year of treatment, I only was sicker and I felt so disenfranchised. And in that moment, I was like, okay, I'm just going to try something different. And I was like, I'm just going to focus on like maybe if there's something that I can eat that's better. And I ended up taking a Indian bread making class. And it was one of those pivotal moments for me because as I'm like walking to like up the stairs to take this class, there was this flyer. And in the flyer, it said, how to treat diabetes naturally. And in my mind, I'm like, naturally, like all I know about how to treat diabetes, right, is metformin, insulin as nurse. And what I didn't know was that I was about to hit gold. And I went to that class. It was my first naturopathic doctor, and I'm gonna share his name. His name is Dr. Peter Buongiorno because what I didn't know was that he was a pioneer in mental health, and he was also at the time the president of the New York State Association of Naturopathic Doctors. So it was like hitting gold on your first shovel. And I was like, I sheepishly went to ask him. I was like, after that course in with diabetes, I was like, can I shadow you? Like, I'm so much more interested. And when I did shadow him, I saw incredible results. And it was then that I was like, I don't know what you're doing, what kind of magic, but I want to do the same thing. And that started me on my trajectory towards becoming a naturopathic doctor.
That is that is amazing. That's like a meant to be. It's like almost destiny.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember like his what he told me was just follow your heart. And I've really been doing that since. So thank you, Dr. Peter.
That is so interesting because yesterday during the live, we were literally talking about intuition, and this is exactly, follow your heart.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. That's how I got into naturopathic medicine.
Amazing. So I'm gonna go back because you're an ND but specializes on PTSD. So how can an ND serve someone who's dealing with mental health issues? Because we often hear NDs treating other chronic illness, diabetes one, and then we have other like hormone imbalance and all the other things. But mental health is it's pretty new. So tell us about it.
Yeah, and that's the beautiful thing about being an ND is it is a holistic way of seeing someone. And so, when someone comes into my clinic and they have PTSD, it's really a chronic metabolic issue. And there's also neuroinflammation. And so when we think about PTSD, we think it's a mental health issue, but really, we don't gain a lot of traction in that person's recovery until we fix a lot of the underlying hormonal issues. So, for example, someone with PTSD, and the like after trauma exposure, what they actually notice is that there's a change in the diversity. There's lower diversity of the microbiome in their gut, right? And then there's a shift in terms of cortisol levels. And so these actually tend to be indicators. Once you see the microbiome shift, you actually see a rise in like flashbacks. And then when you reincorporate certain bacteria, you'll see, and this probably needs to have more studies, you'll see that there's a correlation with some of those symptoms starting to decrease. So when we think about PTSD, it is not just purely like a memory, a mental health issue. It's different hormones that are actually out of balance. So one of the things that I also do with them is called chronobiology. Because with PTSD, you lose the circadian rhythmicity. Right? A lot of appetite issues with with my clients, a lot of sleep issues. And guess what? The circadian rhythm is essentially what helps to dictate the rhythm of the different hormones and also cortisol. So there's a lot we can do. And in fact, I've often found that the multifaceted approach is really what helps people with PTSD. Yeah, so naturopathic doctors can do a lot of that, like a lot of supplementation, and also, to the hormone aspect, right? In PTSD, it's usually kind of a low cortisol state, right? And what else impacts cortisol? Environmental toxins, some of the foods that we eat. And so essentially what we want to do is support a natural return of rhythmicity to those cortisol levels.
Wow, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, it does.
People don't talk about it enough. I mean, it's like it makes so much sense when you talk about it.
I know. And this is why like I'm so passionate getting this out, because if you really just focus on the mental health symptoms, you're not going to one, get a lot of traction, but also there's blood sugar imbalances also with PTSD. And anybody who's ever hangry knows that it's really hard to like calm yourself down, right? Because it's not an issue with your mindset. It's an issue with your blood sugar. And so that's why like it's really fundamental to understand these physiologic imbalances.
Makes sense. So along the line of PTSD, what is trauma healing?
Yeah, I love that question, because I think when people think about trauma healing, and this is also because I'm a CPTSD survivor, when people think about trauma healing, they think I'm going to do all the work until I get to a place where the trauma never happened. And that's actually not the case, right? Because that actually will set us up for burnout, because we're going to keep doing the work. What initially I thought it was if I do enough coffee enemas, if I do enough meditation, I'll eventually get to a place where I'm Zen. But trauma healing is actually about being attuned and connected to our experience, and essentially being able to compassionately navigate when we're coming up against our trauma responses. And that I found to be much more helpful and gives people actually access to recovery much faster than telling them just work harder.
I think that this also probably have a lot to do with sustainability, right? Like if you actually adapt this, then you're able to sustain and then actually maintain it, rather than it's like a quick fix, which then eventually leads to burnout.
Yes. And also there's this idea of like it's going to be rainbows and unicorns when it's right. That's really not it. Yeah, it's about compassion and attuning to yourself.
Hmm. Now, going back to the anger, like, can trauma also manifest as anger?
Yeah, it can. So, anger is a protected mechanism. There's actually nothing wrong with the emotion of anger. It's a spectrum of the human experience, right? And there are also evolutionary benefits to anger. Um, and really, what happens with trauma, right, is that it almost heightens that protective state, right? And it also creates boundaries. And sometimes the boundaries are a little too hard, right? Like kind of pushing people away. Um, but it's also protective in the sense of I'm going to try to keep myself as safe as possible, right? And that's completely okay. We have to just help that person to be able to feel safe in their body and have that felt sense of safety, right? And so once we start to do that and give them access to, and also actions that they can take to help them feel safe, then their anger can subside. But also, I just want to mention that anger also has correlations with certain neurotransmitters. So things like cortisol and dopamine. So there is correlations with having heightened stress, right? That it's going to make someone have more of a tendency towards anger.
Mhm. It might sound simple, but maybe like it's actually quite complex. It's like, what is anger? How do you like define it?
Yeah. So anger, mostly protective, right? And it's in anger, you're right in saying that it's complex because um, there are some evolutionary ties to feeding. And the reason why is that, again, that angry scenario, right? I mentioned we all have had that kind of experiential awareness of those ties. But also from a hormonal standpoint, ghrelin. Ghrelin is that hormone that makes your stomach growl, right? That growling aspect. It's also tied to the sympathetic nervous system, which is tied to cortisol
Yeah.
and norepinephrine. So when we are hungry and when our blood sugar drops, we will have greater levels of cortisol, and we will also have greater levels of norepinephrine. And why is that? Right? For some people, when the blood sugar drops, you actually move into a hypoarousal state. You actually get fatigued and tired, right? Well, that's not actually helpful, right? If you need to eat, you need to forage and you need to kill something. But if you're like slumped over, right, super tired, then your success in being able to catch something, to kill it, and then raise your blood sugar level, that's going to be impaired. So to actually survive, you need hyperarousal when your blood sugar is low. And so, there's that connection there between anger being protective, anger being an aggressive tool so that you can successfully hunt.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
This is so cool.
Yeah, it is so interesting, right? And really my hope is that in teaching people about these biochemical and evolutionary things, it breaks the stigma really of, oh my gosh, I'm an angry person. No, you've got anger being uh, coming up in ways that are actually maybe protective and in survival.
There's like a lot of actual like physical effects of anger with your hormones going and then your feelings and then that kind of like uh influence how you actually respond to the situation.
Yes. Yeah, so when you move into an anger state, right, it's usually that flush of cortisol, that norepinephrine, and you can feel your heart start to race. Right? You might feel tension, and the reason why is because you need to fight, run away, you need to do something. And so some of those things are correlates with feeling angry.
What are some ways that we can deal with anger?
Right, that's a really, really good question. So I kind of look at anger from an evolutionary perspective, right? And so before I get into mindset with my clients, right? Because we're so quick to go into mindset that we jump over the physiologic mechanisms that are possibly at play when someone's angry. So, for example, I talked about blood sugar issues. So, in working with people with PTSD, we have to make sure that their blood sugar is stable, right? And so I tell them protein every 3 to 4 hours, just so that you can have that nice, stable blood sugar. Then you're not dealing with the ups and downs while you're dealing with the stressors of your life, right? Dehydration. When you're dehydrated, well, guess what? Cortisol not only manages stress, but it's also what helps to maintain your water balance. Okay? If you're not sleeping, then your brain is slightly more inflamed. And guess what? Cortisol actually has to come up a little bit even more so that you can maintain arousal, right? And then there's also other things that can come into play, like inflammation. And that's why the environmental toxicants. Someone has higher levels of inflammation, the most potent anti-inflammatory of our body, guess what, is also cortisol. And so we have to look at all these different things that are physiologically creating alarms in our body that manifest in that person as an experience of anger. And once we kind of work on those things, what they recognize is their fuse isn't as short. And then we can talk about mindset, right?
Wow. This is so amazing because like we're kind of like just dealing with the symptom, but then when you actually dealing with the underlying part, and it makes actually dealing and healing a lot easier.
I know. It demystifies the whole thing. It's not, healing is accessible for people if they're doing it in a very fine-tuned way and they understand how to work with their body. That's why I'm a big proponent of don't work harder trying to manage your symptoms. Really work to understand what's going on. That's why we talk about root cause, right? You probably have other guests and they talk about root cause, because otherwise you're just kind of spinning your wheels and trying to get somewhere. But when it's fine-tuned, man, it's so much more effective for the patient. They're not going to be as burned out during recovery.
Is that the reason that telling yourself to deal with it, it's actually not the answer?
Yeah. Because that's a mindset thing, right? Mindset is really just the tip of the iceberg. When you deal with the other physiologic things and you balance those out first, they're going to have much greater capacity to handle the stressors. They're not going to immediately go into protective defensive mode.
What is emotional resiliency? Because I know you'd also talk about that, and then how it could help us cope with anger.
Yeah, so I love that analogy of the fuse, right? Because when you wake up in the morning, right, your fuse is quite long. You've just woken up, you've rested. Your nervous system is in a better place to handle stress, right? And you're the most resilient when you wake up, right? And then when let's just say you wake up and you drive your car to work, right? The fuse gets a little bit shorter because you're cognitively trying, you're trying to be resilient during these little stressors. But then all these little stressors start to add up and eat that fuse and shorten that fuse, right? So by the time 5 p.m. rolls around and you also didn't eat dinner yet, you are ready to you're just ready to explode, right? But also there's this concept of cognitive overload, which is essentially when you've had to cognitively keep yourself together, you end up, if you consistently do that throughout the day, right, you end up having less cognitive capacity to really dampen down the emotional responses. Because that's really the work of the prefrontal cortex, right? The cognitive aspect is to essentially be kind of the modulator for all the lower brain functions. But if you're using that all the time to manage tasks, to manage your kids, right, and to parent, then towards the end of the day, you've had less cognitive overload and you've had less emotional resiliency, right? And emotional resiliency also is is not isolated from physiologic resiliency as I've been talking about. Right? So with emotional resiliency, you have to focus on the cognitive stuff. You also have to focus on the physiologic stuff, and then you can move into emotional resiliency. So here's another interesting thing. Children, when they develop, the precursor to emotional stability is actually proprioception. And proprioception is the nervous system being able to orient and locate itself in space, right? So some people may not, they've been sitting in their, chairs all day. They aren't moving their bodies, right? And so they're maybe not, or they have chronic pain, right? So they're not maybe oriented in space. So that's one of those things that you actually need to move your body so that then you can maintain that emotional resiliency.
Moving your body probably also help with your physical resiliency as well. They kind of like go hand in hand, I guess.
Absolutely, right? They call them emotions because they're in motion. They need to move. And movement does that.
Amazing. How does talking with others about their anger also help with your anger?
Okay, that's a really, really good question. And this is also at the heart of PTSD recovery. It's really through relationship and social engagement. And the reason why is that the most effective way to handle stress is through social connection and engagement. Okay, so our vagus nerve, which is the nerve that is largely responsible for calming us down, for also helping us to reach cognitive peak states, performance states, flow states. That's the vagus nerve. Right? So when we're under stress, we want to use social engagement as a way to help us handle stress. Right? The lesser optimal ways to handle stress would be like the fight or flight response, the shutdown response, which they're helpful. Yes, they get us out of survival, but it's really through social engagement. So when I'm angry, right, let's just say I'm just flipping my lid, right? And you're not. And so essentially what I'm doing subconsciously is I'm mirroring and borrowing your nervous system. So you're sitting there and I'm like freaking out and you're taking your deep breaths. And what that's doing for me is it's creating empathy and starting to mirror your balanced, regulated nervous system. And it's way better to do that than to tell them to relax. Yeah, so it's your presence. That's why it's so helpful when somebody's just like talking, venting, and you're like, oh gosh, that must be so hard. Because you're mirroring them, you're giving that space, empathizing with them, and they're borrowing your nervous system.
Amazing. That makes so much sense. So what if you're like on the receiving end of someone else's anger? Like, what are some ways that you can de-escalate that situation? I guess like being calm and then give them confirmation and acknowledgement is important.
Yeah. And so, really truly, like I want to be mindful and manage expectations that some of these things are practiced, right? If someone comes at me like and just slaps me, I'm probably going to be in shock, right? I would 100% be this like Zen master would be completely inaccurate, right? My ideal response would really be to first ground my body, right? And assess for safety. What's the appropriate response here? Like, is this an unsafe situation where I actually need to declare my boundaries and protect myself? Or is this a situation where I need to give that person space and I need to actually mirror a more calm state with them? Okay. And after I kind of parse that out, right, then it's really important to kind of, once that situation is de-escalated, to renegotiate your boundaries, reevaluate them. Yeah. And there might also be reparative things that you might need to do, right? So if somebody is an intimate person and they're angry, right, they might just need that space. Or if they're angry at you, there might be when they calm down, because when you're in fight or flight, the prefrontal cortex goes offline, right? You move into the emotional brain. And so that's why oftentimes you'll say things that you don't mean because the inhibition is gone. Right? And so there might be the preparative things you might need to come together and reconnect when you're both in a regulated state.
Wow. Wow. There's like so much to learn from you. Um,
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that.
you have like so many great resources. So what is your daily mental health checklist? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so it's essentially a checklist that makes concise, actionable steps that are really going to make a difference in your mental health. And it's not just like, they're not just things that I put there willy-nilly. There's actually some neuroscience behind it. For example, one of the steps is to make sure you're getting sunlight for 15 to 20 minutes. The reason why is because your hormones like cortisol, serotonin, melatonin will actually start to sync with a circadian rhythm. And the other one is protein every 3 to 4 hours, and the reason why is blood sugar regulation. Another step is movement. And again, we know how important movement is for emotional stability, but also in terms of just circulating your blood, metabolizing hormones. There's a lot of benefit to that. So it's really like, what do you need to do daily to maintain your mental health?
Amazing. Tell us about the Healing Trauma Naturally website.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of things at play when it comes to trauma. And conventional therapy is really cognitive behavioral therapy, right? There's a lot of evidence that says there's benefit to that, and there's medications, right? But not everyone, including myself, those are great ways to stabilize. But then how do you move into thriving? And so we have to look at natural things, and it's the journey to PTSD recovery. It is a very unique journey. And so not everything is going to fit everyone. So it's about empowering people to have all these different methods that are natural and that are really going to move them towards thriving.
I also feel not just for people with PTSD, it's literally for everyone. For your daily checklist, and then like how you sort of maintain your health, thinking about these things, then actually have much more resilient emotional well-being. It's literally like for everyone, because who doesn't have stress?
Yeah. And unfortunately, especially with what's happened with COVID, we have, and especially because we're not as emotionally resilient because there's so many things happening in the world, right? In a state where we're not as emotionally resilient, we have more, unfortunately, risk to develop PTSD. So the more resilient we are, the less likely we'll develop.
Absolutely. How can a person work with you?
Yeah. So right now, I'm launching the Manage PTSD 6-week program. And essentially the goal of that is to help people move into recovery, not by working harder, but by understanding their trauma responses. So that starts September 6th. I also have a free 5-day PTSD reset where they learn what are the foundational things to manage PTSD. And then I'm only taking several a month for one-on-one coaching, and that is something that they'll have to email me for that.
Amazing. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing these.
I'm
It's
so glad
amazing.
for this.
I feel that there needs to be more NDs and doing mental health related stuff. Like you, we often interviewed NDs, for managing nutrition, managing other hormonal imbalances, but not on a ton on mental health. And this just makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and thank you for recognizing that. Yeah, it's an underserved field, and I think naturopathic doctors have so much to be able to contribute.
Amazing. Thank you so much
Thank
again
you.
for sharing your knowledge. And we're gonna be following you, and we're gonna promote your program. This is amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for all the good work that you do for SMDs too.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Yes, take care.
Bye.